Today, I'm looking at 3 myths that might be holding you back in your landscape photography. Does the internet or online communities have you believing that you need a better camera, or maybe you've got the wrong camera before you can really practice landscape photography, or that's why your images aren't great? Or maybe you've got the rule of thirds so ingrained in your head that you walk up to certain scenes because it doesn't quite fit this rule that you just walk away and don't take the picture thinking it's not going to be a good picture because it doesn't follow the rule of thirds. Or maybe you find yourself short on time or not enough budget to go do big expensive trips or travel for long weekends or weeks at a time, and so you think, I just can't get good pictures as a landscape photographer. It's real easy to fall into the trap of thinking some condition must be true in order for you to do something else. In this particular case, capture amazing photos. You hear something repeat some piece of advice often enough that you start to think, well, if I can't do that, then I can't do this. And while a lot of times I think those people do have good intentions and that their intent behind the advice is good, if you hear it often enough and you start to ingrain it as a condition that must be true, it starts to hold your landscape photography back. And that's what we're going to look at today. 3 things I've heard people say and repeat that I think are myths and are probably holding your landscape photography back. Let's jump in. So first up, one I hear a lot is you have the wrong camera, or your camera isn't good enough. Maybe you're in the Nikon system, but because you're only shooting with a Nikon Z6 or a Z6 II, you can't do what you really want to do. You should have the Nikon Z7 II, or maybe the Nikon Z8 or something like that. Maybe people say it's the wrong camera brand. Maybe they'll say, oh, the dynamic range of the Canon isn't good, you need a Nikon to shoot. Or the autofocus is terrible on the Nikon, you need a Sony to shoot. At the end of the day, gear is just not that important. And I get it. I talk about gear on this channel. A lot of photographers I interact with, we talk about gear. Can this do a little better? Can that do a little better? What's the advantage of this or disadvantage of that? And it's okay to talk about gear. I mean, when you can't get out and photograph, it is just one of the topics that we like to talk about. And that's okay. But don't let yourself fall into the trap of saying you can't get out and take amazing photos because of the gear you have. Think about it. Look back to some of the classic photographers you probably admire, some of their work. They were probably either shooting on film cameras, or maybe they were early adopters of the digital format, and the cameras back then, they didn't have great dynamic range, they didn't have great resolution, but people still made some really amazing images. Even if you look at my own examples, when I came back into photography, I borrowed my wife's old Nikon D3100. It's like a 14 megapixel camera. It's pretty much a basic starter kit camera. It's the one that you would go out and you'd get the camera and 2 kit lenses, and it gave you a really good start. But by today's standards, its technical specs are pretty pale in comparison to what I use today. Even to this day, one of my more popular images that I've sold here and there was actually shot on that Nikon D3100. It just goes to show you don't have to have the latest, greatest camera or be in a certain camera brand to get great images. Even today, while I tend to shoot with my Nikon Z7 II and I do a lot of videos on the Nikon Z7 II and why I think it's a great camera, this Nikon Z6 II also goes out with me on the majority of my landscape photography outings, and it's either as a backup camera or a second body that I shoot with while my main camera is on the tripod or something like that. But at the end of the day, when I get home from one of those trips where I've had both the Nikon Z6 II and the Z7 II with me and used them both on that outing and I share my images, I never get asked, did you shoot that with the Nikon Z6 II or did you shoot that with the Nikon Z7 II? No one cares. And there's a big difference in the resolution between the 2 cameras, but still, no one cares what camera I shot it with. So don't let yourself fall into this trap of saying, my gear's not good enough, my camera is the wrong brand, my camera can't do this, my camera can't do that. Good landscape photography is not dependent on how much you spent on your camera gear or whether you have the right or the wrong brand. So don't fall for that myth that your camera gear isn't good enough. There's so much more that contributes to a good landscape photo. Things like your technical skill with the camera, things like being able to see the light, learning to see the light, and things like your composition. Speaking of composition, this brings me to myth number 2. The rule of thirds. You must always use the rule of thirds. Or really, any composition rule, there's several of them out there. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to stick to the rule of thirds because it's the one I hear most often. Our phones even can enable the lines for rule of thirds. And it's the one that gets repeated a lot. And I see some people falling in the trap of always thinking everything has to meet the rule of thirds to be a good photo, and it's just not true. First, what is the rule of thirds? Essentially, it is you've got your frame, and it means positioning your main subject of interest off to one side on this third of the image, this third of the image, maybe towards the top, maybe towards the bottom. It's sort of a guideline, it's a principle. If you place your main subject at one of those points, it makes for a more compelling image. And don't get me wrong, I fully support learning the rules of composition, but treat them as guidelines. Learn them, understand them, and learn when to apply them to the scene that you're photographing. Rule of thirds is one composition rule. Maybe leading lines, maybe layers, strong foregrounds, midgrounds, and backgrounds, maybe simplicity in your composition. All of those are good rules and guidelines to form great, amazing images. But trying to adhere strictly to one popular rule and always applying it and making sure it's always there is going to hold you back. Sometimes bending those guidelines a little bit will help you make a better image. Not all scenes fit the rule of thirds. There are times that deviating from that is helpful. Let's take a look. So in this particular image, this is an image of Cucumber Falls, and it's in Pennsylvania. And I have the waterfall pretty much placed in the middle of this image. And even for me, this is one of those scenes where a lot of times when I'm photographing waterfalls, a rule of third works pretty well, right? You put your waterfall there, you got the water that leads away from it, and it just makes sense in the frame. But in this particular image, I felt like the trees on my left, trees on the right helped frame the waterfall. And by getting those trees in there and putting the waterfall towards the center, I've got it nice and framed. I've got a strong rock in the foreground. Again, in my opinion, I'm not seeing the water lead from the waterfall, so I'm using the rock as a foreground. Then I've got that little bit of sun haze, bright light up at the top, sort of framing it in from the top with a bright spot and a darker spot. So this is a particular case where even though I do tend to use the rule of thirds a lot of times for waterfalls, it doesn't work for every single scene. This is a case where I centered the waterfall, and I think this photo worked out pretty well, and I've always been pretty happy with it. Another example here, this is a wintertime photo that I took in Hocking Hills, and it's a snowy scene, and again, it's another case of where I have this waterfall centered. I've photographed this waterfall many a time, and most of the time I have it on a rule of thirds line. In this particular case, because of the snow and the environment and how far back I was, I felt like the leading line of the creek that the water was falling into helped to make a more compelling image. So I placed the waterfall in the center of the image, and I'm more leaning on the leading line to make it work. Again, this is just a case where even though a lot of times I do apply the rule of thirds to waterfall images, sometimes it's okay to deviate from that, break the rule if you think it makes for a more compelling image. So again, rules of composition are important. I encourage you to get out there, learn them, learn the rule of thirds, know what it is, learn about how to use leading lines, learn about textures and simplicity and layers, and learn about how light can shape a composition and all of those things. Learn those and, go out into the field with them as tools in your toolbox, but treat them as tools in your toolbox, guidelines to the scenes you walk up to, and not a strict set of guardrails that confine you to how to approach every single scene. And the final myth, you don't have the time or money to travel for your landscape photography, therefore I can't get the images like everybody else gets. This one I hear a lot. I see so many people that don't go photograph when they're near their home. They only go photograph when they've been able to travel to some great place. Anyone that's watched my videos for a while knows I place a lot of importance on practicing locally. There's so many opportunities to help improve the way you use your camera, whether it be how you technically use the camera, getting more used to it, how it acts in certain conditions, to the composition rules that we talked about just a little bit ago. Yes, don't abide by them every single time, but learn them so you know when to apply them, how to apply them, and when it makes sense. And just general, get out there and get used to seeing the light. It's a great way. If you can repeat visit an area, you start to learn how the light works, how it influences what might be a boring scene one day and turn it into something amazing the next. All of those skills being practiced locally can help you if you do get the opportunity to travel, even if it's just for a long day trip or a long weekend trip. That practicing locally is super important. You don't have to travel to be able to get great landscape photography images. Now, I live in the Midwest. I get it. I'm not getting these grand vistas of mountain views and snow-capped peaks or anything like that. I've got some hills off to the southeast of me. I'm more or less in a fairly flat part of the state, but there are still things for me to go see. And again, because I can revisit these scenes so frequently because they're close to me, it increases the odds that I'm going to be able to visit when there's some interesting condition happening that makes them even more beautiful than they already are. Let's take a look at a couple of images to demonstrate that. First up, we've got this fall scene. This particular scene was taken at one of my local metro parks. I go to this park all the time, either just for family walks or out with my camera in the early mornings or late evenings. This particular scene was in the autumn, and it was a foggy morning. Fog was coming in over the river. I got the nice trees, and I've always been really happy with this photo. Like I said, it's just my local metro park. I didn't have to go anywhere grand. It's just a scene that unfolded in my local metro park 15 minutes away from my house. So don't underestimate photographing locally. Stretching out just a little bit more. This one's more like an hour away, 55 minutes to an hour away. But here we've got is just a tree in the snow. This particular area I went to does happen to have waterfalls, gorges, big boulders, and all sorts of stuff. But at this particular visit, the snow started coming down, and I really liked how this tree stood out against that snowy background. Now, I traveled 55 minutes for this, but I bet if I looked hard enough around my local area within a 15-minute radius, I could easily find other parks that if I'd visited while it was snowing, I could have been able to piece together some interesting composition very similar to this. So again, you don't have to travel super far distances in order to practice your landscape photography and create great images. And it's not just me who thinks you can get great images locally, even if your environment isn't the most amazing. There's a few Midwestern photographers I follow that do great work in similar Midwestern environments where we don't have grand mountain scenes or anything like that near us to photograph. We've got Nick Becker, does some amazing work. Yes, he travels some, but so much of his work is locally based and just very interesting scenes. We've got Brent Clark, who does something similar. Yes, he travels some and gets some amazing scenes, but it doesn't limit himself to just travel photography. He gets out there and creates interesting scenes within his own Midwestern environment. And then we got people like Garrett Hess, who does similar things, who just, they are able to take their own local area in the Midwest. Again, we're not home of a lot of great mountains or canyons or anything like that, and they still create some very powerful work just working locally. So don't let your location or lack of time and budget to travel hold you back. It's a myth that you have to travel for landscape photography. Get out there, practice locally, and work on creating those great landscape photos. So those are just 3 myths that I wanted to highlight. There's a lot more myths out there. It doesn't take much time on the internet or in an online community or hanging out in a lot of photography clubs to hear something where you start to tell yourself, I have to do this in order to do that. If you find yourself in that position, there's a really good chance that you're listening to some myth that simply isn't true and it's holding you back in your landscape photography. Anyways, I hope this video was helpful. I hope it removed some hurdles so that you can get out there and start creating those great landscape photos. And if you liked what you heard today, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, and mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you for watching.